All right, let's jump in. We're about to explore one of the most dramatic turnarounds in history. I mean, think about it. An entire continent just shattered by total war somehow rebuilds itself, only to be split right in two by a completely new kind of ideological conflict. This is the story of Europe's journey from ashes to a new and pretty uncertain identity.
You've probably heard this quote. With this one powerful phrase, Winston Churchill didn't just describe a division, in a way, he helped create it. The Iron Curtain wasn't just a metaphor. Nope, it became the chilling reality that would define the next 45 years, setting the stage for decades of tension and a global struggle for dominance.
So, to make sense of this super complex era, we're going to break it down into four key transformations. First, the Cold War's division and then reunion. Second, Europe's economic rebirth. Third, the surprising return of nationalism. And fourth, the social revolutions that really changed everything. Then we'll pull it all together to see how these forces shape the Europe we know today.
Okay, our first big transformation, it kicks off right in the rubble of World War II. But instead of peace, a new conflict pops up. This was an ideological showdown, right? The United States versus the Soviet Union. And it created this bipolar world with Europe caught directly in the middle.
Now, this division wasn't just philosophical, it was fully militarized. In the West, you had NATO, a US-led alliance built on that key idea of collective defense. And in the East, the Soviet Union created the Warsaw Pact as a direct counterweight. The deal was an attack on one was an attack on all. And boom, the continent was locked into two hostile armed camps.
So you might be asking, why didn't these massive armies ever just go at it? Well, the answer is this terrifyingly rational idea called mutual assured destruction, or MAD for short. Both sides knew that if they launched a nuclear attack, they were guaranteeing their own total obliteration. It was a kind of peace, yeah, but a peace held together by the threat of complete annihilation. Just a crazy high-stakes standoff that shaped every single geopolitical move for decades. Because they couldn't fight each other head-on, the superpowers waged war by proxy. They just poured weapons, money, and their ideology into these regional conflicts, turning local disputes into massive global battlegrounds. The wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Afghanistan, they became these absolutely devastating arenas for the clash between capitalism and communism. After decades of this stalemate, the end came with just breathtaking speed. When the Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev introduced reforms trying to save the system, he actually, and unintentionally, doomed it. It was like the floodgates just opened. By 1989, the Berlin Wall crumbled, and by 1991, the Soviet Union, one of the world's two superpowers, had just dissolved. The Cold War was over. All right, on to our second transformation. While the East was kind of frozen in the Cold War, a totally different story was playing out in the West, a miraculous economic recovery. And the goal wasn't just to rebuild, it was to rebuild in a way that would make another huge European war basically unthinkable. The engine behind this whole recovery was the Marshall Plan. America invested a staggering $13 billion to rebuild Western Europe. But listen, this wasn't just charity, it was a brilliant strategic move. By getting industries and economies back on their feet, the U.S. created strong, prosperous allies, a firewall of capitalism against the spread of communism. And all this new prosperity, it allowed for the creation of the modern welfare state. The thinking was pretty simple. To stop a return to the extremism of the 1930s, governments built these cradle-to-grave safety nets. Subsidized healthcare, education, pensions. All of it created a secure middle class, which is really the essential foundation for a stable democracy. This timeline here shows just how this radical idea took shape. It started simply by merging the French and German coal and steel industries, the literal building blocks of war. The idea was to make conflict economically illogical. This idea grew and grew into a common market, then the formal European Union, and eventually a shared currency, the euro. Step by step, historic enemies were binding their fates together. It's pretty incredible. But our third transformation shows a powerful countercurrent. This whole move towards a unified Europe did not just erase centuries of national, ethnic, and religious identity. In fact, in a lot of ways, it brought these old tensions roaring right back to the surface. The first major crack in that old world order was decolonization. European powers, just financially and morally exhausted by the war, lost their grip on their global empires. This is a direct reversal of the imperialism we talked about in earlier units.
As nations in Africa and Asia fought for and won their independence, Europe's centuries-long dominance of the world stage just came to an end.
And this nationalism also exploded within Europe's own borders. It took a lot of different forms. You had religious conflict in Northern Ireland, separatist movements in Spain, and ethnic clashes in Chechnya. But the most terrifying example, by far, was the collapse of Yugoslavia, which just descended into this brutal war of ethnic cleansing in the Balkans.
The brutal reality of this resurgent nationalism is captured in this one staggering number. In Bosnia, Serbian forces engaged in a campaign of ethnic cleansing and genocide. The result? The deaths of nearly 300,000 people. It was a horrifying reminder that the ghost of ethnic violence had not been banished from the continent.
Now, our fourth transformation shifts away from geopolitics and looks at the huge social changes that redefined what it even meant to be European. This whole era saw a new focus on individual rights, on identity, and a widespread challenge to traditional authority.
A major driver of this change was second-wave feminism. It built on the earlier suffrage movements, but it declared that true equality went way beyond just the ballot box. Activists were demanding equal pay, reproductive freedom through access to birth control, and a fundamental rethinking of women's roles in society. It was a revolution, plain and simple, in the home, the workplace, and in government.
All of this rebellious energy really just boiled over in 1968. In Paris and all across Europe, a new generation took to the streets. They were protesting the Vietnam War for sure, but they were also rejecting the entire post-war world their parents had built. Its consumer culture, its rigid hierarchies, its inequalities. This was a full-blown revolt against the establishment. At the exact same time, the very face of Europe was changing. The post-war economic booms created a need for labor, which brought in so-called guest workers, and decolonization led to migration from former colonies. This permanently transformed European cities, creating these vibrant multicultural societies, but also sparking new social tensions over what national identity even meant anymore.
So where does all this leave us? Let's try to synthesize these four powerful transformations to really understand the complex, often contradictory identity of Europe as it headed into the 21st century.
When you boil it all down, Unit 9 tells one huge overarching story: the end of European global dominance. Stripped of its colonies, overshadowed by superpowers, Europe's role in the world fundamentally shifted. It was no longer the world's master, but a key partner in a new, deeply interconnected global order.
This brings us to the central tension of modern Europe. It's this constant tug-of-war between having a unified system and preserving national sovereignty. The entire EU project, from the day it was founded to modern debates over things like Brexit, is defined by this single, unresolved conflict.
And that leaves us with the fundamental question for Europe's future, as it confronts all the crises of the 21st century, from climate change to war. Which path is it going to choose? Will the forces of integration win out, or will that powerful pull of nationalism ultimately tear it apart? That remains the defining and still unresolved question for contemporary Europe.